Hi, it's Mr. Bennett. In this video, what we need to talk about is aquatic ecosystems. We've been talking about communities, biomes, food chains, and food webs, and every example that I've given you has had to do with the land. Well, 2/3 of the earth is covered by water. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how the concept of the biome, how the concept of food chains, food webs, and community interactions apply in the water, in the oceans, and in the rivers, and so on and so forth. Now, there's some major factors that affect aquatic ecosystems. That on land, the main factors that affect the ecosystem is going to be the climate. What's the temperature and how much precipitation does the area get? Well, in the water, it's a bit more complex than that. The temperature definitely does affect an aquatic ecosystem, but amount of precipitation, we don't bloody care because you're in the water. Hello. So the factors that affect an aquatic ecosystem is we need to talk about water depth. This is a huge one. This is probably the most important factor that affects an aquatic ecosystem is how deep in the water you are. Now the reason why this matters is you see that we have two zones here. We have the photic zone and we have the aphotic zone. What that is photo means light, and so the photic zone is an area that has light and the aphotic zone is an area that doesn't have light. Why do we care? Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis can only happen in the photic zone, which goes down to 200 meters under the surface of the ocean, so 600 feet. Once you get deeper than 600 feet, not enough light makes it through the water in order for a plant to do photosynthesis. So the photic zone is the area of the ocean where photosynthesis can happen, and it's the top 200 meters of the ocean. And this is going to have a major effect on an aquatic ecosystem because if photosynthesis can't happen down here, that's going to mean there's a whole heck of a lot less food to eat. So that has a major effect on the ecosystem. The other reason why water depth is important is deeper water usually tends to be colder water. And so that's going to have a major effect on an aquatic ecosystem. So water depth is important. Is it deep enough? Is it too deep for for enough light to get through it to do photosynthesis? Other factor that affects an aquatic ecosystem is water flow. Now obviously in the ocean we're not going to talk much about flow, but when we're talking about rivers, the flow of the water makes a huge difference. What you're looking at here is two pictures of the Colorado River. Here's the Colorado River where it starts in Colorado. Here's the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. Near its source, the Colorado River has very clean water that's moving very fast. Here in the Grand Canyon, you can see it's very dirty, very muddy because the water is going much slower. How fast the water flows has a major effect on the ecosystem and what things can live there. So the amount of water flow, that's a factor that affects an aquatic ecosystem. Now, part of the reason why water flow is important is because it has a big effect on temperature. Usually, fast-moving water is cold and slow-moving water is warmer. And so the temperature of the water makes a big difference. A great example of that is salmon. Salmon are famous, everybody knows about them, and salmon cannot live in water that is warmer than 70 degrees. Once the temperature of the river hits 70 degrees, they all die. Another example of that is catfish. Catfish, if the water gets down too cold, they die too. So the temperature of the water has a major effect on what living things can live in the water. And the reason why the temperature of the water is important is the temperature of the water affects the chemistry of the water, which is very important. So the chemistry of the water is going to have a major effect on the aquatic ecosystem. Specifically, the pH, is it acidic or is it base? Most rivers have a basic pH to them, so that means they have a pH above 7. But every organism that lives in the water has a sweet spot for pH where it can survive. And so pH has an effect on an aquatic ecosystem. And then the amount of oxygen that is dissolved in the water, that also has a major effect on an aquatic ecosystem. What you're looking at here, this is an axolotl. This is a type of salamander that lives in Mexico. And what you're seeing here, these are his gills. And what you can see in these gills is all the gills are is a place where an animal pumps blood into a tube. And this axolotl's tubes right here in its gills, it's absorbing oxygen directly out of the water. Fish don't breathe water. Fish absorb oxygen out of the water. And so oxygen can dissolve into water just like sugar or salt or anything else can. And that is where fish and salamanders and so forth get the oxygen that they need by absorbing it out of the water. Well, not all water has the same amount of oxygen in it. The colder the water is, the more oxygen will be in it. Also, the faster the water is moving, the more oxygen will be in it. So here, this white water here, this is cold water that's moving really fast. This is going to be water that's going to have tons of oxygen in it. Really slow-moving, turbid water is going to have a lot less oxygen in it. So these are four main factors that affect all aquatic ecosystems, and based on these factors, that's going to have a major effect on what living things can live in that area. So now that we've talked about the factors that affect an aquatic ecosystem, the depth of the water, the temperature of the water, the flow of the water, the chemistry of the water, now let's go through and let's talk about examples of aquatic biomes. Now we're going to break this up into freshwater biomes, and we're going to break it up and we're going to talk about saltwater biomes. So what are some examples of freshwater biomes? What are some different places that you find fresh water? Well, just think about all the places you find fresh water on the planet. An example would be a flowing water biome or a flowing water ecosystem. So here we got a picture of Cub River up Willow Flat. This would be an example of a flowing water biome because, duh, the water is moving. Opposite of a flowing water biome is going to be a standing water biome. This is going to be lakes. Here's a picture of Bear Lake. Okay, so these are going to be two different biomes because in one case the water is moving, in the other case the water is just sitting there. Now because the water is moving, that's going to make it so certain organisms can survive here. Because the water is standing, that's going to make it so another group of organisms can survive here. So flowing water and standing water, those are two examples of freshwater biomes. Another one's going to be freshwater wetlands. If you drive over by the airport, you'll find lots of wetlands. And what a wetland is it's a place where the water is not deep enough to call it a lake, but it's not moving, so we can't call it a river, so we call it a wetland. Here you can see all this water here in this wetland. You can see the plants growing up through it and the birds out there waiting, getting them some food. This is an example of a freshwater biome, a place where it's really wet, but it's not deep enough water to be considered a lake. That's an example of a freshwater biome. And then our last example of a freshwater biome is when you talk about estuaries. Now what an estuary is an estuary is where a river empties into salt water, usually the ocean. Now estuaries provide for some really interesting ecosystems going on there, because it's a mixture of freshwater and saltwater. If you look at this picture up here, the river up here, the water is 100% freshwater. The closer it gets to the ocean, the more saltwater it becomes. The reason for this is because of the tide. When high tide comes in, that's going to force salt water up the river, and it's going to make this area more salty. And then when the tide goes out, that water drains out, going out and off we go. So when you have an estuary like this area right here, here we're looking at it at low tide. When the high tide comes in here and the ocean's up at this level, that's going to cause the river to flood this marshland up here and make it go underwater. So estuaries are unique because you have a mixture of fresh and salt water. And the other thing about estuaries that make them unique is, if you remember, the limiting nutrient in a freshwater ecosystem is going to be phosphorus. The limiting nutrient in an ocean is going to be nitrate. Well, when that high tide comes in from the ocean, it's going to bring phosphorus up into this marshy area right up here. And then the river is constantly bringing nitrate downstream with it. And so estuaries often have really high growth of organisms because you don't have any limiting nutrients. The ocean is bringing phosphorus, the river is bringing nitrate, and that kind of gives you the best of both worlds. So those are our four examples of freshwater biomes. So now that we've talked about freshwater biomes, let's talk about saltwater biomes. And the term we use for saltwater is marine biomes. First one we need to talk about is, let's talk about the intertidal zone. The intertidal zone is the area right next to the ocean that gets flooded by high tide. If you've ever been to the ocean, you'll hear people talk about high tide and low tide. That twice a day the ocean comes up really high, and twice a day the ocean shrinks back and it goes lower. This is because of the gravitational pull of the moon. So this area, this is a picture of what this area looks like at high tide. This is a picture of what it looks like at low tide. This whole area here that you can see that is exposed, this is the intertidal zone. And organisms that live here need to have the ability to spend half the day underwater and the other half of the day out of the water. And that's your intertidal zone. In your intertidal zones, you find tide pools, and tide pools are areas in the intertidal zone where the water gets stuck in these tiny little pools when the tide goes out, and you find all sorts of neat organisms that live in that area. So the intertidal zone, that's our first example of a saltwater biome, an area that spends half the day underwater and the other half of the day exposed to the air. Moving out to the ocean, so here's our intertidal zone right here. The next area we call the coastal ocean, and I'm going to include in this the coral reefs. For up to 200 miles from shore, the ocean really doesn't get that deep. It stays pretty shallow, relatively speaking. This is what we call the coastal ocean. The coastal ocean is a different biome because you notice, I've already shown you this picture, the whole area of the coastal ocean is in the photic zone. So the coastal ocean is the area close to the coast where the water isn't really deep yet, where we're able to do photosynthesis. And because photosynthesis can happen here and lots of plants can grow in this area, that allows for lots of living things to live in the area. So that's going to be the coastal ocean. As we move out further from shore, then we move into what we call the open ocean. Now, the open ocean is honestly pretty much a desert. That once you move away from the coast far enough that the ocean is deeper than 200 meters, you don't find a lot of living things, because out here in the open ocean, the water is too deep for photosynthesis to happen. Without photosynthesis, you don't have a producer. Without a producer, you don't have any food. There's nothing for anything to eat. So out in the open ocean, you don't find very many living things. That 96% of all living things that live in the ocean live in the coastal ocean, where it's shallow enough that photosynthesis can happen. The last biome we're going to talk about with the ocean is we're going to talk about the benthic zone. And what the benthic zone is, pure and simple, is it's the floor of the ocean, the very bottom of the ocean. Even at the very lowest part of the ocean, and the lowest part of the ocean is the Challenger Deep at, the Marianas Trench. It's 36,000 feet deep. The ocean here is 36,000 feet deep. It is so deep at the Challenger Deep that if you put Mount Everest there, the tallest mountain on Earth, it would still be 6,500 feet underneath the surface of the ocean. So crazy deep. But even here, at the deepest point of the ocean, living things can still live there. That you find things like corals and so forth that can live at the very bottom of the ocean, which is the benthic zone. So our four marine biomes, we've got the intertidal zone, the area that gets flooded twice a day. We've got the coastal ocean, right close to land, where the ocean is still shallow. We have the open ocean, which is out in the deep part of the oceans where not many things live. And then finally we have the benthic zone, which is the absolute floor of the ocean. So now that we've talked about the different biomes that you find in aquatic ecosystems, let's talk about food chains and food webs and how that works in an aquatic ecosystem. That every example I give you of a food chain or a food web involved land. So let's talk about what that looks like in the water. Now, when we're talking about food chains in the water, all the same terms apply. Producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary and quaternary consumers, all of these things still apply. We still use the same terminology when we're describing a food chain in the water as we would to describe a food chain that happens on land. The big difference between an aquatic food chain and a terrestrial food chain, or one that's on land, so to speak, is the type of producer. On land, the producer is all going to be plants, big plants that you can see that can do photosynthesis, that produce the food that is going to be consumed by later steps in the food chain. In the water, we don't really have big plants. There are some examples like kelp and so forth, but the most important producers in the water are going to be these things that we call phytoplankton, or algae. These are tiny microscopic organisms, usually just one cell, that are capable of doing photosynthesis. So these little guys here, they can all make their own food. This is going to be the basis for every food chain that happens in an aquatic ecosystem, is what do you have there making food? In this case, it's going to be phytoplankton. Now, I know I said that they are only single-celled, but they can reproduce really quickly, and you can get a lot of them. Here's a picture of the Pacific Ocean off Washington State. You can see that the water is really green. The reason why the water is really green is because a whole bunch of algae grew there. And so this algae can be eaten by things that we call zooplankton. Zooplankton are tiny microscopic animals that go around eating algae or phytoplankton all day. And then the zooplankton can be eaten by fish. Those fish can be eaten by slightly larger fish. And then those larger fish can go ahead and be eaten by things like whales and sharks and so forth. And so once again, we apply the same terms to an aquatic a food chain that we do to a terrestrial one. The big difference is who's the producer. We don't have a lot of room for plants out in the ocean, but we do have the ability for these little phytoplankton to float around and do photosynthesis, making their own food. So what does it look like if we put a bunch of that together to make a food web? Here's an example in an aquatic food web. So we have down here, we've got our phytoplankton doing photosynthesis, making food. The next level, we have our zooplankton, which eat the phytoplankton. And then the zooplankton can be eaten by lots of stuff, things like shrimp and small fish. And then those things can be eaten by slightly larger fish. And then finally, we top off with things like sharks and marlin and so on and so forth that way. So that would be an example of an aquatic food web. Now, just as with a terrestrial food web, if you knock any of these species out, it's going to have a major effect on everything else that's going on there. That if you take out the tuna, for instance, and we are catching a lot of tuna because we like it on our sandwiches, all of a sudden these sharks here have less to eat, and they have to start eating other things. So like these smaller sharks maybe have to start eating more squid or other types of fish like mackerel and so forth. And so just as on land, if you knock out one species, if you knock out a species in the water, the food web can have major consequences as well.